hear me and see me properly? Could you give me a thumbs up, Teresa? Can you hear me and see the images clearly? Rosemary Lyon, yes? All right. Today, we're going to be speaking of one of the great civilizations of the world, the Maya. And the idea is not only to discuss the ancient past of the Maya, not only to talk about their archaeology and their accomplishments, but also to speak of the painful conquest of them and of the Mayas today. One of my favorite books on archaeology is by Jacques Soustelle. And Jacques Soustelle describes as one of the most moving experiences in his life when he was flying from Guatemala to Tikal. And he says that below the airplane, he could see this ocean of green jungle that extended enormously. And then suddenly, coming out of the trees, he saw these magnificent pyramids coming out, like a triumphant cry of those who lived there thousands of years ago. We're seeing the magnificent Maya, that by their sole existence contradict this Eurocentric idea that culture only flourishes in the temperate climates. This is an idea that has been used to discriminate people from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia. But here you have, in one of the thickest jungles of the world, the Mayas, that created a culture with a notational zero, with advanced architecture, with very sophisticated art, with a sustainable agriculture. And the first question we ask ourselves when talking about them, and a question that is very relevant today, what the crisis of today is a contradiction between human development and our environment. And contrary to what happens in Western cultures, where we have an adversarial relationship with nature, where we cut all the trees and we transform the earth into a domesticated parcel that gives us only those things that we plant or conceive in that terrain. So, in opposition to this, the Maya had a harmonious relationship with nature. And a very interesting aspect of their culture is that they could create a sustainable agriculture with products such as corn. But at the same time, they maintained a dialogue with nature. In Europe, you go from agricultural societies, from nomadic to agricultural societies. But the Mayas maintain both practices simultaneously. And they find ways to grow products that coexist with the jungle. They farm in a system of terraces, for example, that prevents the erosion of the land. And then they combine different agricultural products. For example, instead of only planting corn or beans or calabazas, no? What they do is that they mix them. And so you have the nitrate that the bean introduces into the earth. And then, the calabaza produces a big leaf that protects the corn and the bean. And the corn gives a structure for the bean to grow. But what is even more interesting is that the Mayas allowed the jungle to coexist with their cities. In their cities, they were spaces where you had a virginal jungle there in their homes. In other words, instead of cutting all the trees, of domesticating the earth, they allowed it to live with them. And they kept observing and learning from it. And this is how they discovered a whole variety of products that we didn't know existed. For example, rubber that comes from a certain type of tree, where you cut them and you have the drippings that produce a material that introduces a whole new dimension to human activity. Or cacao, or many trees that produce medicines. So you see, from the jungle, the Mayas obtain construction materials, wood, ropes, cotton, a constant richness of products that heal them, that protect them, and that give them, together with the agriculture that they developed. In other words, it's the coexistence of a dialogue with nature and the planting certain sustainable crops. And from this combination, the Mayas obtain perhaps the greatest thing a society can aspire to, which is free time. Without free time, there is no art, there is no science, there is no philosophy, there is no poetry. And so the Mayas were able to create all this, not in spite, but because of their relationship with the jungle. And the society that they created was fascinating. Physically, the Mayas were stunning to look at. They had these very elaborate clothes. You have some ceramic figurines that gives us an idea of their appearance. They had beautiful jewelry, and they grew their hair long, and they cut it in different planes, and they had decorations of flowers and feathers that sometimes were 30 to 50 centimeters long. And they had a whole collection of feathers that they used from the jungle again. Then they practiced, they believed that the more aesthetic was to prolong the line of the cranium and the nose. And so since childhood, they put some wood in the kids so that their head would grow in a different way. They also inserted jade and jewels in their teeth. So they must have been absolutely unforgettable to see. And they are also among the first to create clothes from cotton. And the way that they did these clothes is still used today. El telar de cintura. And they used all different colors. Again, the use of colors was a gift from the jungle. They could find a whole different variety of tones and colors, certain types of blues and pinks that were unknown in the rest of the world. Even their shoes are beautiful. Many people, assume that people in the tropics are barefoot, but the Mayas had more beautiful sandals than any European. Now, from a hierarchical point of view, it was a society that was ruled by a monarch, by a king. Then you had the aristocracy and the warriors. Then you had the artisans and the people in charge of commerce. And at the bottom, you had the peasants. However, it was expected from the upper classes to commune with the ancestors. And to do this, the royal family had to practice self-sacrifices. Here you see this image in Jaxchilan of a Mayan princess that is passing a rope through her tongue to bleed, or they bled their genitals. And so this blood was burned, and it was supposed to stimulate the communications with the ancestors. The soldiers were also expected to lead by example. And the priests had all this knowledge about calendars and about cycles. But again, this knowledge was not just theological. They were also expected to assist people in the crops and in the planting. So all of these measures created a ruling class that could not become despotic because of all these traditions that humbled them and that forced them not only to give orders, but also to serve in a very real and personal way the entire community. One of the great achievements of the Mayas is in their writing. In the ancient world, there are only 5 systems of writing: the Sumerian, the Egyptian, the Chinese, the Harappan, and the Maya. And in the Maya world, the word to call the writer and the painter was the same. The word sib. And writing was really an art form, a calligraphy of enormous beauty. The Mayas also invented paper from the amate tree. And so they had thousands of books. Their books were like fans. Here you have a typical Mayan book. And sadly, in one of the great tragedies, cultural tragedies of humanity, the Catholic Church burned and destroyed all the Mayan books. Only 4 have survived. Can you imagine? And this debacle was promoted by the church as an institution and directed by people who should have known better, such as this man that we see here, the Franciscan Diego de Landa. Diego de Landa had arrived to the Yucatan in 1562. And so he spent a great deal of time studying the Mayan culture. He learned Mayan, and after this deep understanding, he concludes that the only way to convert the Mayas is by force. And so in a brutal campaign, he creates these autos de fe, where he burns the books and the idols and even people. So harsh are the methods that he uses against the Maya that the conquistadores are shocked by his cruelty and denounce him to the Spanish crown. So he's called to Spain for trial and imprisoned. And while he is in jail, he writes a book called The Relationship of the Things of Yucatan. And so with this book, he is exonerated and he is sent back to the Yucatan as a bishop. He establishes his infamous church in Izamal, and he continues with his forced conversion and systematic destruction of the Mayan culture. Now, in his book, he sat down a Mayan scribe, and he dictated an alphabet, and he asked the Mayan scribe to write the equivalent in Maya. So you see A, B, C, etc., M, N. Now, how did we get to decipher this language? After Landa's brutal methods, by the 1600s, there was not a single living person that could read Maya. And many years later, in the early 20th century, the Carnegie Institution commissioned a work to unearth Chichen Itza. And this was interrupted because of the Mexican Revolution. And so during this period, there was an intense study of the Mayan hieroglyphics. And there was this Englishman, Eric Thompson, that emerged as the greatest Mayan expert, who affirmed that the Mayan script was not phonetic. It was strictly logograms, like symbols. And this was the vision that was sustained most of the 20th century. Now, what happened was in World War II, at the end of the war, the US set out to punish Germany. Germany was already defeated, but still, You had these massive air raids, basically doing carpet bombing in German cities. Among them, the city of Dresden, that was just basically turned to dust. And the American bombs were directed even to the Dresden Library. And so in this mayhem, there was a Russian soldier, Yuri Norosov, who was an expert in Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so this man rescued from the Dresden Library a copy of one of the few surviving Mayan books, as well as the book of Diego de Landa. And so back in Russia, he learned Spanish. He translated Diego de Landa's book. And he started to believe that the Mayan alphabet was phonetic. And so he found, by comparing, some of the animals in the Dresden Codex and the sounds, that they were equivalent. And so he conceived an idea that maybe there was a relationship with the current Maya as it's spoken today and the language. This idea at first was completely rejected by Eric Thompson, but then you had a new generation of archaeologists like Michael Coe and especially Linda Shealy that started to apply the ideas of Norosov. And in Palenque, they came across the logogram of King Pacal. And they realized that they looked at the logogram and it looked like a shield. And so at first they called him Lord Shield. And so Moises Morales, it was an expert in Palenque, guide. So why don't you give him a Mayan name? He says, shield in Maya is Pacal. And so then they looked at the logogram and they found that one part of it was like the drawing of a shield, but then it had three other ones that were the sounds pa, ka, and la. And so then they come across with the idea that the Mayan writing was syllabic, like phonetic, and ideographic. In other words, it had the symbolic component, but it also had the phonetic component. And so thanks to this idea and to the work of scholars like David Stewart, finally the Mayan code was cracked. Now, you may ask yourselves, why the seal of the Catholic Church to destroy the Mayan books? The reason lies in one of the Maya's greatest achievements in their mathematical system. The Mayas had a 20 number system. And you said 1 with a dot, 2 with 2 dots, then 5 with a bar, and 6 until you get to 19, and then you use 0. Very few cultures had discovered the 0. It is one of the greatest accomplishments of the Maya. Without a notational 0, you cannot do advanced mathematics or calculations. But yet, the Catholic Church believed at the time that the impossibility of the void was the proof of the existence of God. So, so when they realized that the Mayans were talking, that is why they opposed the use of zero, because they considered it heretical. Because affirming that there is a zero is affirming that there is a void. And if God is everywhere, well, then there cannot be emptiness. There cannot be a void. And so this is the reason why the Catholic Church condemns Mayan culture as heretical. And in a tragic loss, they burn all the Mayan books except 4. In 1582, a Pope, Gregory the 13th, finally accepts zero. But by then, the damage was done. Fortunately, as we have seen in some of these slides, in addition to paper, the Mayas also wrote in stones, these stelas that they placed in their cultural, their centers, these stones that had dates in history. That and the 4 codes is all we have. The Mayas also had one of the most complex calendars in the world. More than a calendar, they had a system of calendars. And they had one was a sacred calendar that was 260 days, months of 20 days. Then they had a solar calendar, 365 days, like the one we have today. Now, the solar calendar and the sacred calendar interconnect every 52 years. But then you have dates that are repeating. And so to be able to record a longer period of time, the Mayas developed the long count. And this long count has a year 0, which is the 11th of August of 3114 before the Common Era. We don't know exactly why, but there is a precise date 0. What the Mayas say is that they had a period had ended, the third creation had ended in that day, 13 Bactums. And this is why, if you remember in 2012, when another period of 13 Bactums concluded, there was some idea that they said that the Mayas were predicting the end of the world. It's not, so it's just a different time period. However, the fact that we've been able to establish a correlationship between the Mayan long count and our calendar has allowed us to place in perspective all the Mayan development that we divide basically in 3 great periods. The pre-classic, up to about 100 before the Common Era. Then the classic between 200 after the Common Era to about 900. And then the post-classic until the arrival of the Spaniards. Also of great interest is Maya's knowledge of astronomy. And we can tell their sophistication by the way they built certain buildings. Here we see the astronomic center in Chichen Itza called the Caracol. And it's built in such a way that in every window you can see a different astronomical view. Or certain buildings, for example, here you see that from the pyramid, you can see the solstice of the sun. And then in each corner, you see the others. So by the way that buildings are placed, you can visually see equinoxes and solstices. This is perhaps the most famous of them. You see the shadow of a serpent descending of Quetzalcoatl during the equinoxes. So it is surprising to realize that they could create a building so precise that in one day of the year, it would produce a specific desired shadow effect. And like this, we find many other elements where you can actually see in the pyramids, through their orientation, the passage of Venus, the passage of the rising and of the sun, the position of the sun in relationship to the earth. From an artistic perspective, the Mayas developed all of the arts. Their music was exactly the opposite to the Western music. In the Western music, we have basically abstract sounds that are notes, you know, do, re, mi, fa, sol. What the Mayas did was a recreation rhythmically of the sounds of nature. You have probably seen like the water sticks. When you move them, they produce like the sound through seeds, like if the water were flowing. This is just a small example. They had, for example, an enormous variety of whistles that could recreate the sounds of birds and the wind in certain conditions. They could recreate the foliage. In other words, they could set the sounds of nature in rhythm. And their dancing was the first in the world to use point shoes, something that would happen in Europe hundreds of years later. Their paintings, they created a fresco system that has survived in spite of the humidity of the zone. And some of these murals, like this one in Bonampak, is one of the greatest pictorial recreations of music. See the musicians and their trumpets, and you see more. You see the place that music occupied in that society. In the murals in Bonampak, we also see that, contrary to what many believed originally, the Mayans were also warriors. So you see these constant battling between the cities. The beauty of Maya's creations is also present in everyday objects and in jewelry, in earrings, in necklaces, in masks, but especially in pottery. These pots are beautiful not only in their construction, but also in the way they are painted. I'm a friend of Dori Spudette of the University of Duke, who has done deep studies about the Mayan art in vases. And nowadays, photographically, we can see these paintings of vases. And she has found that some of these vases are actually signed. So that the idea of great masters existed among the Maya. Sadly, the looting has prevented us from seeing many of these pieces in their context. Now they are stolen, they're trafficked, and so then you have an individual vase that is sold or bought, but we don't see it in the context in which it was created. So much has lost because of this looting. Mayans were also masters in bas relief, as you can see in these examples, and in sculpture. But again, their idea was the integration of the arts more than any other culture in Mesoamerica. So we see these sculptures, these bas reliefs, as part of an integrated whole. And the Mayan architecture is valuable not only because of its practical contributions. Here we see different types of houses, and we see things like the elevation of the houses to prevent plagues, or the special design of roofs to prevent humidity and water, or the strength of their buildings and their arches, the Mayan Arc of Labna. The Mayas were also among the first to use the golden mean, which is the secret of the beauty of nature. So we see these natural proportions in their buildings. So beautiful are the Mayan buildings that they have inspired modern architects from all over the world. Here, I prepared a section where you can see the Mayan building, and then you can see the modern building that it inspired. And among those that have recreated the Mayan style are none other than Frank Lloyd Wright, among many, many others. But what I find so remarkable about the Mayan buildings is not only the beauty of their form or the intelligence of their orientation, but also the details of their walls, the skin, so to speak, of a building. Look at how, especially in the style of architecture we call Puk in the late classic period, notice how every detail of the building is worked. Notice the forms, the geometrical forms, the forms of snakes, the representations of gods, in this case, the god of rain, Chak. But it's almost like a Baroque element about it, a beauty that I don't see in any other pyramid anywhere else in the world, frankly. No discussion of the Mayas would be complete if we do not talk about the ball game. As we said before, because of their connection with the jungle and their relationship with nature, the Mayas could discover rubber. And with this rubber, they could create a ball that could actually bounce. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived and they saw this ball with movement that seemed to have a life of its own, that seemed to stay afloat like an earthly representation of the sun or the moon. And it is very moving for me to think that the entire ball games in the world have an origin in the Mesoamerican ball game. There would be no soccer, no football, no basketball, no volleyball without this rubber ball. And this connection to nature, that I insist is very important. How many things can be discovered from nature that are still being discovered. Here you see how the rubber is obtained. And the ball game in the Mayas and the Mesoamerican is much more than a sport. You find it in the Popol Vuh, the book of creation of the Mayas, as well as the figures of clay and they had these protections in their knees and in their joints. Today they play the game, but I haven't seen them being so careful in protecting the players. This is this kind of eye-shaped ball game with two circles was characteristic not only of the Mayas, but all the Mesoamerican world. Always you see this structure. And in the ball game, they were not supposed to use their feet or their hands, only their hips. And as I said, today, there's been an effort in some places in Mexico, mainly in Sinaloa, to recreate the ball game. And I hope, that here in the US, we could see kids practicing the ball game. I think it would be so cool and so interesting to do. And let me share with you just a little bit of how this sport or this game was played. Now, for many years, it has been very difficult to visit the Mayan world. I mean, we can all go to Chichen Itza. No, you go to Playa del Carmen or Cancun, and there you can see Tulum and Chichen Itza. But if you want to see, for example, Bonampak, you have to go to Mexico City, and then you have to go to Chiapas by land, and then you have to go by mule across the jungle. Or if you want to go to Tikal and Copan, you have to go to Guatemala, and so on. So now there's been an initiative of the Mexican government to create a Mayan train, and it's a controversial project. Some believe that it will, introduce massive tourism, and that this will harm the Mayan sites. Others believe that it could do for the Mayan world what these ships of passengers did for the Greek islands, where you could not only visit Athens, but then you could take these cruise ships and go to the different Greek islands like this. I would certainly welcome the possibility of traveling across the great Mayan cities. And there's just so much more to be discovered. We believe that only about 3% of the Mayan cities have been uncovered. So within this vast universe of Mayan cities, I have chosen 6 that I would visit first. And there's many more, and I know that I'm going to get into trouble here, but let me share which ones I I would go first. I would start by Tikal in Guatemala. What is so important of Tikal is its verticality, the idea that the gods are higher than the trees and the mountains, so that the pyramids should be seen. This that we know of Tikal today is only a fraction of what exists. It is believed that there are more than 3,000 buildings hidden in the jungle. And not only are the buildings very tall, but they have on top these like crests that make them look even higher. There's just some of the the projection of these magnificent buildings. It is believed that there are more than 1 million objects here in an area of about 16 square kilometers. It's about 4 square miles, approximately. Another wonderful city in Guatemala is Copan. And Copan is one of the earliest Mayan sites. And what is so remarkable about it are these massive stelas that are at once sculptures and are also pieces of writing that have only recently been deciphered. Then we have a jewel of a city called Uxmal. Uxmal, perhaps one of the most beautiful. And it's so harmonious that it is believed that it was built from a central plan. Among the many beautiful buildings in Uxmal, we have the Temple of the Wizard. And this temple is round, it's round corners. And then we have the quadrangle of the nuns. These names were put by the Catholics, not the Mayas, of course. And then what is perhaps the most beautiful Mayan building, which is the Palace of the Governor. Again, beautifully proportioned, exquisitely worked, beautiful in every way, from afar and from up close. Then we have Palenque. Palenque, and we have, as more has been studied, we have found that the orientation of Palenque is all astronomical. The creation of its temple of the sun and of the cross all have to do with astronomical calculations. It has this quadrangle of the palace, the temple of the sun, and then the magnificent temple of the inscriptions. And it was in this temple where the greatest tomb of the New World was found. We have in 1952, Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz started to descend in the middle of the pyramid. And after years, he discovered that the entire building was a tomb. He said, when he arrives and he sees this huge slab, and he touched it, and I felt I was in the border of history and fantasy. Here is the original movie of Alberto Ruz and his descent into the tomb of the great Bacal. And when they removed that the slab, they found this magnificent tomb of a king that had ruled Palenque from 12 to 80 years old. You see this jade mask and jewels. And Rus kept a very close inventory of everything that he discovered. And the slab that we see here shows us Bacal and what appears to be a cross, but that is not a prefiguration of Christianity, but the four directions. You see this jaw that he's sitting on at the underworld, and you see the paradise above and the different levels of the underworld below. Then there is Bonampak. That is my favorite. Bonampak is in Chiapas. You see, you have Tikal in Guatemala, Copan in Honduras, Bonampak in Chiapas. And Bonampak has among the greatest murals in the New World. And here you see these images that are not color corrected. They are the way the murals look now. I was telling you before that some original scholars had assumed that the Mayas were completely Pacific, but the murals in Bonampak demonstrated that this was not so. And they even proof the war and then the harsh treatment of the captives that were sacrificed. And then, of course, we have Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza is visited by more than 3 million people each year. Now it's no longer permitted to climb on the pyramid. And it is it is not just an architectural beauty, but it is also a homage to time. It's got 4 stairs, each one of with 91 steps. And then the upper one for the 365 days of the year. And it is surrounded by columns, 1,000 columns, as they are called. It has the Caracol astronomy. And very important, in Chichen Itza, in opposition to other Mayan cities, we see the influence of central Mexico. And we see it in the figures of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and the chacmoles that come from the Toltec culture. So we see in the Mayan a dialogue with other cultures of Mesoamerica. In Chichen, there are also these cenotes, that are these underground rivers where these princesses were sacrificed. Unfortunately, a lot of these offerings have been drenched, and so much has been robbed and lost. And something that has always intrigued us about the Mayas is that throughout their history, we see the systematic abandonment of some of their great cities. For example, in 1525, when Cortés passed through the Mayan region, he passed right by Palenque and Tikal, but they were completely covered with nature. So why would the Mayas abandon most of their cities? And there's many theories. Some archaeologists believe that it is because of war. You know, that societies become more consumed by war as their history advances, and they use as proof the fact that many of the post-classical cities are fortified much more than in the earlier periods. And so that is one idea. Others say that the priests that originally were part of the productive cycle become more consumed by theology. That is possible, but it doesn't explain why, say, Palenque is abandoned, but then Chichen Itza flourishes, and then Chichen Itza is abandoned, but Mayapan flourishes. So we cannot really find an explanation. There are also others that say that the people buried their ancestors under their houses, and that at some point the cities became full of mortuaries, that it was necessary to move and to found another city. Others say that perhaps the cities grew too much and they ceased to be economically viable. But what we believe is the most plausible explanation is that the Mayas believed in cycles of time. And at a certain period or at a certain moment, they decided that it was time to abandon a city and found a new one. And they keep doing this right within the historical process that we are living today. We see it in the conquest of the Mayas. We see it later in the caste wars. So it is possible that the abandonment of the cities had more to do with their calendar and their vision of time that by external or internal forces. Now, this abandonment of the cities that the Mayas did has become a convenient way of not discussing the painful and brutal conquest of the Mayas. I am surprised when I hear even very informed people that talk about the Mayas and they say, well, the Mayas left, as if, they had taken a space shift. They abandoned the city, they left, they were gone. Well, they abandoned a city, but then they founded another one. And where did the Mayas go? Well, they're still there. It's like when people ask, well, where did the Romans go? Well, they're still in Italy, right? So we do know that the conquest of the Mayas was one of the most painful and perhaps the longest in the indigenous world. It lasted more than 400 years. After Hernán Cortés had completed his conquest of the Aztecs, and he went into an expedition to Central America in pursuit of a captain of his, Cristobal de Olid, that had gone rogue on him. And he was bringing as his prisoner the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, the same one that he had tortured by burning his feet, demanding where the treasure of the Aztecs was hidden. Cuauhtémoc never responded. But then in what is now Tabasco, Cortés decided to kill Cuauhtémoc and one of his companions, and they hanged him. This is how the last Aztec king ended. So Cortés, as I said, he was going to Central America, and he passed right by Palenque, but by then the city had been abandoned for so long that they couldn't even recognize it. And eventually he met with the king of the Itzas, the last Mayan kingdom, Canek. And Cortés asked him about Cristobal de Olid. Canek told him that he had gone to what is now Honduras. And Cortés had a lame horse with him. So he gave the horse as a gift to the Maya king. And this horse was venerated. They fed him flowers. They kept him for years. And when he died, they did a beautiful monument to the horse. And centuries later, when some of the missionaries went to the Itzas land, they saw this beautiful monument to a deified horse that had been given to them by Hernán Cortés. Cortés never found Cristobal de Olid. When he got to Central America, they told him that he had been killed by his own men. And so rather than going back by land, he took a ship and went back to Mexico. But he decided to dispatch the cruelest of his men to conquer the Mayas. And this man was Pedro de Alvarado. Pedro de Alvarado was responsible of the massacre in the Great Temple. A cruel and despotic man who entered through Guatemala. It is said that he murdered the Quiche king with his sword across his chest. And it is said the Quiche believed that since then, the Quetzales have a red chest. And so he quickly established a brutal reign in Guatemala. He became the governor of Guatemala. And he created these encomiendas. And he became vastly rich. He was restless. He was trying to go to Peru, but Pizarro did not accept him. He married a woman that was a red-haired woman who supposedly was even crueler than him. And he's so ambitious that he decides nothing less than to complete the expedition of Christopher Columbus. And so he builds 13 ships, and he takes them to what is now Jalisco in the Pacific Ocean. And he was getting ready to travel to the Indies from Mexico. But then he suffered an accident. A horse fell over him and killed him. And we never knew what happened to the ships. Meanwhile, he had left his cruel wife in charge, and she became the first women governor of Spanish territory. And she was brutal and cruel with the Mayas, but fortunately, there was an earthquake. And then, the earth seemed to swallowed this wretched woman. But the Spaniards retained the control of Guatemala. But in the central part of Yucatan, the Mayas had learned to fight the Spanish. There was this man, Gonzalo Guerrero. And Gonzalo Guerrero was a Spaniard that had become shipwrecked, and he had become a Maya. And so he had taught the Maya how to fight the Spaniards. And contrary to the Aztecs that had this vision of the Spaniards as demigods, the problem with Moctezuma, and later in the year we will have a presentation on the Aztecs, is that Moctezuma wasn't sure if the Spaniards were other men or were the descendants of the plumed serpent of Quetzalcoatl. This doesn't happen to the Mayas, because Gonzalo Guerrero explains to them exactly who they are and how to fight them. Gonzalo Guerrero, that is to this day considered a Mayan hero. So the Spaniards control Guatemala and control Yucatan. But in the middle, in the Petén area where the thickest jungle is, the Itzas establish their last independent kingdom. And they continue to fight. But then and for decades, the territory of the Mayas cannot be occupied by the Spaniards. But then in one of these strange visions of time or cycles of time, the Itzas, they were the founders of Chichen Itza. They were now in the Petén area, descend from the Petén and ask to speak with the governor of Yucatan. And they tell him that they're ready to negotiate, that a new cycle of time has begun. The negotiation doesn't work in any way, but what it does do is that it gives the governor of Yucatan, Martín de Ursúa y Arizmendi, the ambition of finally conquering the Mayas. The Mayas, their city was the city of Non Petén. It was basically on a lake, and they defended it with these canoes, and they had a very elaborate system of darts and arrows, that they used poisons to keep the foreigners out. This was one of their canoes. And so what the governor, Martin de Ursoy Arizmendi, decides to do is at first he builds a road close to the Itza region, a Camino Real. And then once he has this road, he brings men and supplies, and he erects a royal galleon that is armed with cannons, 6 cannons per side, with a tripulation of over 100 men. So they launch this royal galleon in the Petén Lake, and in a few hours, they destroy the last Mayan kingdom. With the cannons, they basically break all the pyramids and the monuments, and they set everything ablaze. And then the soldiers come down. It is said that they drown the children. They tie rocks and throw them into the lake. And they even kill the women and cut their breasts, a massacre. And it is like a dawn of slavery for the entire Mayan region. Everything becomes a huge slave camp where whatever remnants of culture were destroyed, the Mayans were submitted to all kinds of mistreatment. And here you see some of the documentation of the Mayas themselves, of the way they were treated by the Spaniards. So it is a period of unbearable oppression. Mexico becomes independent of Spain in 821. And in the chaos of the War of Independence, there is an ambitious Spaniard, Pedro Imán, that thinks that he can have an independent country. And so he arms the Mayas with muskets and artillery, and he trains them how to use it. This man would never succeed, but the Mayas would never return the weapons. And eventually, they would form a relationship with the British in Belize to supply them with ammunition. And so for the next 80 years, the Mayas would be a group in what we call the caste wars. And they would fight against the Spaniards right up to the 20th century. The entire area of Yucatan becomes a war zone, with the contrast of the fighting Mayas and then the brutal exploitation in the Mayan haciendas, in the haciendas of the Spanish in the Mayan territory. There is the enequén, there is a fiber that is also a source of great exploitation and misery for the Mayas. And finally, Porfirio Diaz, but we're talking of the 1900s, gives the Brits all kinds of concessions in Mexico, allows them to build trains, to bring business, but in exchange of these conditions, he demands that the British cease to support the Mayas. So once the Mayas are isolated, have no longer ammunition, he dispatches another evil military, Ignacio Bravo, to finally submit the Mayas. And this man kills more than 200,000 Mayas. But imagine, this is the 1900s. So the Mayans still inhabit south of Mexico and Central America, still conserve their language and many of their traditions, and still are repressed. In Central America, we have seen a systematic persecution of the Mayas. All the movement of Rigoberta Menchú, that won the Nobel Prize, was a denunciation of people like General Rios Montt in Guatemala. Then the whole Central America has become a disaster. You know, the Contras war, the deportation from the US of some of the most vicious gangs like the Maras Salvatruchas, and basically a decomposition of the social order. So a lot of those descendants of the Mayas have tried to emigrate and to form a better life. And sadly, most of those children that are still held in cages in the US-Mexico border are descendants of the Mayas. Most of them are Mayan children. Many of them have lost their parents forever in a very cruel fate of destiny. So I want to finish this presentation by remembering a dear friend of mine, the painter Raúl Anguiano. Raúl participated in 1946 in the expedition to discover Bonampak. It was a tragic expedition because several of the leaders of it died. But Anguiano came looking for the Mayas of the past. And he found those extraordinary murals that I recently shared with you. But he found something else. He found also the Mayas of today. And these lacandones became the subject of his paintings. And it is through his relationship with them with which he finally found his voice. And he revolutionized the arts in Mexico. So I think that, like Raúl Anguiano, it is very important to learn and to study the Mayas of the past, but also to discover, connect, and help the Mayas of today. Thank you very much.
You can unmute now if you'd like to make comments. And you can also raise your hand and we'll call on you. Gregorio will call on you.
Anybody want to make any comments or say anything?
It was terrific.
Thank you,
Good
Gregorio.
job, Dad.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Could I ask a question?
Please.
Were there any trans-Pacific crossings with Asia? I've read about that. I don't know if that was with the Mayans. Trans-Pacific crossings with Asia.
Well, there's some theories that have studied the currents and have found that it is possible to travel from Asia to the Americas.